thank you very much, Mark. It's been a real pleasure being able to not only write this book, but also to discuss it, to talk about it. I'm thrilled with the opportunity. I've often been asked, oh, just a minute, let me fix my speaker. Okay. I've often been asked, how did you even start this book? I mean, I'm talking about two Black protagonists, Horace and Frederica. They're escaped slaves. Not being Black, myself, not being a slave, myself, I have really had to dig deep to find out what this experience was for these dear people. I think it all started when I realized that Oregon was founded as a racist utopia. It was a state that was founded in 1859, the only state in the Union that was founded with a Black exclusion law written right into the charter. That exclusion law really said that no Blacks could come into the state, no Blacks could work in the state, no Blacks could own property in the state. No, in other words, you had no rights. As a matter of fact, in 1844, there was the Black Lash Law was put into effect because of the immigrants that were coming into Oregon at the time. Now, this Black Lash Law said that if there was a Black person living in Oregon, a white person could encourage them to leave by whipping them 39 times every 6 months. That was quite astonishing to me. It was later amended to say you don't lash them, but at least encourage them to leave by forcing them into public labor, which means that even though there was slavery outlawed in Oregon, it was still, it was kind of understood that Blacks weren't welcome and they could indeed be slaves for a while until they left. So I started with this idea of these poor people trying to find their own freedom. Libertas is Latin for freedom. So they come out of the South. They come up to New York. They make their way to Buffalo. And by the way, 19th century America is fascinating. I really had a wonderful time finding all these little divots about life in America in the 19th century. They actually had to go through the Erie Canal, and the Erie Canal had just been built. And in this place, they were using horses and carts to pull the barges through the Erie Canal. They make it to Buffalo. And in Buffalo, another little historical fact that very few people know about was that Buffalo experienced a Seiche. A Seiche, what the heck is a Seiche? It is a tsunami that happens in freshwater lakes. And this was an amazing occurrence, and it happened at midnight. And I actually wrote a little piece about that here in the book. I'm going to read it to you. The Seiche was it's a French word for cat. Here we go. Lake Erie had long been known for its violent nature, cleaved by ice not once but 3 times, establishing boundaries and identities with each glacial insult. Eventually, it became an angry, lacerated wound. Native Americans who lived along its northern shore named it Irgi, the cat. And for good reason. The cat was capricious, its unpredictability dangerous, its tantrums of thunder and lightning spectacular. Due to its shallow depth, in summer it ran bathtub warm, and in winter it was the first lake to freeze. Bordering Canada to the north, Michigan to the west, and New York on the east, It poured most of its fill through the Niagara River and eventually spilled over Niagara Falls. More than 200 miles long and 57 miles wide at best, the Cat was a narrow, shallow grave for those who showed it no respect. Wind and water were natural companions to Buffalo, a city situated on the lake's sharp northeast corner. Buffalo had seen the Erie's fury and endured its temperaments until midnight. On Saturday, October 18, 1844, it began as a zephyr, a playful wisp of air that tousled hair and made children frolic in the park. It came from no discernible direction, just here and there, tossing scraps of paper in its path, whipping up confetti from the street and resting it a few feet away. For hours, the windy flurries became a steady breeze, enough to knock off a hat and have it tumble down the lane. In Buffalo, the wind was common around Lake Erie, but no one paid much mind to it, even when the breeze became a long, cold draft pulling out of the southeast. But this was different. The wind was blowing from the north. But the second day, the gale had strengthened, bullying pedestrians, shoving horses against their loads, shrieking through the city, howling across the lake. By the evening of the third day, it had become an unrelenting fury with hurricane-force winds plowing across the long funnel of the great narrow lake, like the hand of God scooping out the sea, piling the water of Lake Erie to its southern end, draining the northern shore to a sandy bar. Such is the nature of the Seiche, a violent collision of oscillating waves set up by a single-minded wind. The Seiche begins when the wind stops. And once released, this massive buildup of water rebounds to the other side with the force of 10,000 locomotives. The collision creates a backlash of ferocious waves slamming into each other, boiling craters of water, pumping up and down, punching and counterpunching with no forward motion, nowhere for the energy to go. Only a severe agitation of nature hell-bent on destruction. But it was about to get worse. On this particular night, the wind did not stop. It shifted to the opposite direction. With the same ferocity that bulldozed the torrent to one end of the lake, the wind unleashed the surge with all of its kinetic energy and weight, but added propulsion to it. The Seiche was set in motion. The full force and volume of Lake Erie raced back to its receded edge, pushed by a cyclonic wind gone mad. A 22-foot surge of water had a dead aim on Buffalo, asleep in the storm's bullseye, and only one man saw it coming. So that's the beginning of a chapter called The Cat. Now, there are some really fascinating things that happened during the Seiche. Whole steamships were lifted up out of the water and were pushed right into the city of Buffalo. There was one story of a steamship stuck in the middle of the lake after the Seiche had occurred, and they were marooned out there. They had lost power, their paddle had broken, and they couldn't get back to shore. So they had a horse. They had a horse on board, and they put a help sign in the mane of the horse, tied it to the mane, and let the horse flop into the water. The horse had to swim to shore of Lake Erie, and then suddenly somewhere along the line somebody found the horse and realized that there were people marooned in a steamship in the middle of the lake. It was really quite the occurrence, but I'd never heard of that before. So doing this kind of research was really something that was really starting to energize me. But more than that was the entire trip across the plains. very few people understand how very, very hard it is, and it was, to go across the Oregon Trail. We all have our ideas in our minds with Wagon Train, the movies, the Westerns. We think, oh yes, there was somebody and they ate beans and they made it across to this great migration. It wasn't like that at all. It was hard. It was so hard that for every 80 yards, think about that, less than a football field, for 2,000 miles, there was a grave. I'll say that again, every 80 miles for 2,000, every 80 yards for 2,000 miles, there was a grave. Now, these were just not graves every 80 yards. These were massive graves. Sometimes you would go by a campsite and the graves were 50 and 60 people in a giant cemetery by a water hole. People were suffering from typhoid, dysentery, and cholera, among other things. But those were the three things that were really getting at these immigrants. The cholera happened because at every stop along the way, there were no latrines. Now think about it. 500,000 people have come through and stopped at the same water holes over and over and over again. These water holes now became contaminated. People were peeing and pooping everywhere. So now we have contaminated water. We have oxen and horses and mules and cows that are drinking that water and dying. So they're dying, and half of them are bloated in the carcasses are in the water holes. People are also dying. Some of the graves are very shallow. Many times, if the immigrants made it to a campsite at night, they would camp in the dark, wake up in the morning to find that they're actually laying on top of a grave that had been dug up by wolves, and they might find a hand or a bony elbow sticking out of the grave where the wolves were pulling at the corpses. People were running past a lot of the water holes. They wouldn't stop, and they would wear masks. Yeah, they were wearing masks, or maybe just their shawls, and they knew that cholera was at this water hole and they couldn't stop. There were also a lot of deaths due to accidents. Many of these immigrants did not understand how to use a rifle. And they were told by a lot of these guides and guidebooks that come out to, whatever you do, bring a firearm. Well, you're talking to people who are clerks, who were farmers, who were people from retail stores, businessmen who found themselves bankrupt during the Depression in the early 20s and 30s. And so now these people were told to bring firearms because, there might be Indians out there. They didn't know how to use a gun. So a lot of men died from self-inflicted gunshots. And this is how. They were flintlock rifles, very, very hair-triggered rifles. And they were loaded. They kept them loaded. And they would put them in the wagon barrel side out. So in the evening or in the morning or at noon, when they went to unload the wagon to eat, they would pull the rifle towards them. Hair trigger goes off and they'd shoot themselves in the gut. That happened a lot. It's hard to imagine, but it happened a lot. Children, many children died by riding in the seat of the wagon. Because when you're riding in that seat and you happen to fall, and the wagon is rolling, they'd fall under the wheels. The wheels are 4 inches wide and they're wrapped in iron. So these big, heavy wooden wheels that are wrapped in an iron rim, you didn't have a chance underneath that. Sometimes they were pushing their wagons up these ravines and hills, and the wagons would roll back over them. Because the wagons were so dangerous, they decided early on, they learned their lesson and they thought, okay, we're not riding in the wagons, we're going to walk. Everybody walked. So when you see pictures of wagon trains in movies and you see them with reins on their oxen, that's not what happened. They didn't sit in the wagons. They walked all the way, and their shoes worn out, and then they were barefoot. They would walk over prickly pears, lava rocks that looked like glass and were cutting their feet and the feet of the oxen as well. There were also these stories of these giant bugs. They were called Mormon crickets. They were at least 4 inches long, big, thick, black crickets, but they weren't crickets, they were biting insects. And there's a story of immigrants walking for miles on blankets of these black biting insects, crushing them under their feet. And as they crushed them under their feet as they're walking, these other insects would come and eat their brothers. So it was, and can you imagine? It's in their hair, it's in their clothing. These insects were just unbelievable. And then, of course, you had the prairie dogs. They were cute. There were some campsites had miles and miles of nothing but prairie dog holes. So you would see their warrens for miles as far as the eye could see. I describe it as it looks like raisins on a flapjack. And they would all pop up at the same time. And if there was something going on, if they were alarmed, they would all disappear at the same time. And you could see them for miles and miles along the prairie. The prairie was probably the best part of the journey, because when they started climbing and going over the Continental Divide, things got a little tricky. It was, the mountains were really, really tricky. Part of the story in Libertas is one of the subplots in the entire trilogy is the Donner Party. And when I say the Donner Party, most people will say, yeah, those are the people that ended up in the Sierra Mountains and they became cannibals. And that's sort of where the story in your head will end. You have no idea what these people had to endure before they got there, before they got to the Sierra Mountains. They took a shortcut. It was supposed to save them 400 miles. It was supposed to save them about a month's journey. So they left late. They didn't have to rush. They had the Hastings cutoff. They had a book that was written by a man who didn't take that cutoff. That was the first problem. So this cutoff that they took was over the Wasatch Mountains. Now, those of you who understand the Rocky Mountains, you know where the Wasatch Mountains are. They're the mountains in Utah that you go skiing on. That's where Cottonwood is. That's where Alta is. Those are the Wasatch Mountains. This shortcut took this wagon train of about 80 people. Now I'm talking about the Donner Party. They had to cut a swath through the Wasatch Mountains. They had to go up, down, up, down, up, down. They had to cut down the trees. They had to move massive boulders the size of a Volkswagen. There was no forage for the animals. There were no meadows. I mean, these are mountaintops they had to climb through because they were told there was a shortcut there, but there wasn't a shortcut. So they ended up devastated. And this is this is their first challenge. They've come to the mountains and they're lost in the mountains for a month. They make it out, but they're not doing well. There's death. They're losing their wagons. They're losing their oxen. They're running out of provisions. And they just started. Now they've got a desert to go through. And they think that by skirting around the Great Salt Lake that they'll be safe and they'll save time. They weren't prepared for a desert that was really mud. So what happens is you think of the desert as being hard and flat and dry. And, you can scoot across. Well, it wasn't that easy, because while they're going across the desert, they're in they're in mud. The top of the surface was dry, but right below was kind of a muddy, mucky clay surface. And so the oxen ended up struggling through the mud up to their knees, trying to slog and pull these wagons through this muck. And time is running out, because they thought they could make it in 3 days across this desert. The shortcut lied. It was twice as long, no water holes, and they were running out of water now. And of course, the oxen are dying. They're thirsty. They can't pull these wagons. And so in this one particular wagon, the James Reed, very wealthy man, had what he called a pioneer palace. It was a wagon it was a 2-story wagon. Think about this, 2 stories. He was a very wealthy guy, so he could build, he was the Jeff Bezos. He could build a wagon and have all sorts of things in it. So he had 5 beds on the top, feather beds for his family. He had 8 children and his wife and his mother-in-law. They had the bed, and down below there was a parlor. We're talking about a wagon. He called it the Pioneer Palace. The wagon, the bottom part, he had a stove that went right through the canvas top, and he had 2 sofas that on either side of the stove. Quite elaborate. He also had 3 other wagons, one that held whiskey, another one that held books, and all his other merchandise. So they're hauling this over the mountains, through the desert. They finally make it through this desert, but they're now having to throw everything off. I mean, all their valuables, everything is going. That's just one little story. That's just one little tiny piece of a story of how these people endured having to come across an entire continent on foot, barefoot. Now, in this particular instance that I'm talking about now, I'm talking about the Donner Party. In this Donner Party, fascinating little footnote here, and you didn't hear this in school. There was a gentleman who had befriended James Reed, the owner of the Pioneer Palace, and they had been in the militia together. Well, it turns out that his friend from the militia, James Reed's friend, had always wanted to go to California. And this is where the Donner Party wanted to go. They were on their way to California. Well, they talked about it a lot. They thought about it a lot. And his friend was bound and determined to go. But his wife said no. His wife's name was Mary. And Mary said, Abe, I'm with child, and we have another little one. We have a 4-year-old boy, and you have a career in politics. You can't go to California. And that was Abe Lincoln. Can you imagine if Abraham Lincoln had actually joined the Donner Party as he wanted to? He would have been lost in the Sierra. He would have died there, and history would have been changed forever in America. Who knows? We might still have slavery. Just a little footnote. Mary Lincoln, by the way, was in the farewell party. She was waving goodbye as the Donners were leaving. She probably gave them a gift, and it was. But Abe did not go. Thank you, Mary. So now we have Horace and Frederica, our main characters, and they are going across the country, but they think they're going to freedom. But freedom is hard to come by when you're going to a state that has a Black exclusion law. And it wasn't just Oregon. All the other states were becoming very disjointed. Everybody was trying to figure out, each state was trying to figure out how they were going to determine, or how were they going to deal with slavery. And so each state had its own determination. Some were anti-slavery, some were going to have slavery, some were going to say, well, if you're a freed slave, you can stay, but if you're a free Black man, maybe you can't stay. Like in Oregon, here's an excuse that the Oregon legislature, the provisional government at the time, made this was their excuse, that there was so much social discord in the South, where they were coming from, where these immigrants were piling out of. They didn't want trouble. They didn't want all this turmoil between the North and the South. Remember, this is before the Civil War. This whole story takes place in 1846. So in 1846, we haven't gotten the Civil War yet, but things are heating up. And there's a lot of social unrest. So a lot of these white immigrants are coming to the West to get away from it. They didn't want it, but they were blaming the Blacks for the problem. So they thought, well, we'll go to the West, we'll go to Oregon or California or Utah or Nevada, and we'll just exclude Blacks. That way we won't have any trouble. Well, they also excluded mulattoes, Indians, Chinese, anybody that didn't look like them. There were also other problems going on at the same time. The US government, for one, had hired the Texas Rangers. They called themselves Texas Rangers. You've heard the Texas Ranger story. We all think they're such big heroes, and they were great cowboys. Well, these Texas Rangers were hired by the US government to take scalps of the Indians, of the Native Americans, and shove them out, get rid of them. They were trouble. And so they were paid, at first, they were paid $1 a head. Well, it got to be a little clumsy carrying around a lot of heads. And so they ended up saying, the government said, okay, how about $1 a scalp? That was easier to count. So Texas Rangers, and I'm talking about towards the 1880s, 1870s, now they were out there scalping anybody. They didn't care if they were Native Americans or Blacks or Mexicans or Chinese. They didn't care if they were women or children. There was a lot of corruption and a lot of violence going on in the name of the great manifest destiny coming across the country, making it safe for white folks and the white pioneers. It was it's been a journey for me writing this story to bring this to light. And in the midst of it, the hope that these people had, and the leveling, the social, economic leveling of the mere need to survive, the will to endure. That is absolutely amazing to me. I wonder how many of us today could take that trip that way and live through all that, actually endure all that hardship, come across that trip. And listen, it's not just you, the adult. You have 5 or 6 or 7 children with you. Most of the immigrants had large families. They were giving birth. They were burying their dead. And there was no time really to mourn. There was no time to put away your emotions. You had to put away your emotions. There was no time to grieve. So they would, if you woke up in the morning and God help you, you didn't have dysentery, you could be dead by noon. Dead by noon. You felt great that morning, and boom, something hits you. By noon, you're dead, they're burying your grave, and the wagon train has to move on because you only have a very short travel window. And in many cases, when the cholera or the typhoid was so rampant, they wouldn't stop at all. If somebody was dying, they would leave a mourner behind with a shovel, and they would have the grave already dug for the person who was obviously going to die. And they would wait for the person to die, roll him in the grave, and catch up to the wagon train. Many of the graves were dug in the road, in the where the wagons were going to go, so that when they dug the grave, the wagon wheels would pat down the grave and harden it so that the wolves couldn't dig up the dead. No, there was no time for emotion. There was no time to cry or grieve. You just had to keep going. And one of the questions that I thought as I was writing this story is what kind of people did they become when they finally made it to Oregon, and you've had to learn to let go of everything, let go of parts of your humanity, let go of part of you that made you warm, merciful, gentle, kind, compassionate. When all those emotions had to be left behind, you are a different human being than what you started out as. That is going to be part of the theme I'm going to be writing about in the third book. Right now, I am just finishing the second part of the trilogy called Libertas, where much of this is going on now. And I've had a lot of, I've been putting out my manuscript to some folks to have them help me read it. I've given it to some of my African-American friends. I wanted their perspective on the take that I had for these characters. I've given it to friends of mine, Peggy Snyder, who bless her heart, has been helping me with the grammatical, my punctuation. As a writer, this has been a big process. But it's been exciting. It's been for me something that is hard. It's hard to sleep at night. I wake up with conversations in my head. My characters are driving the story. I find myself now sitting down to write, and the characters are just taking it. They're taking it over. So they're writing their own story right now. And I hope that when I'm done with this trilogy, that we will all have a better understanding of our own history in Oregon and a better understanding of how we've come to be there. There's also that there's something else. It's the resiliency. You can say a lot of things about what they had to sacrifice, but life and sacrifice have come together and created a resiliency that is a very big part of the American spirit. And I'm plowing through that right now and finding the whole experience quite gratifying and fascinating. And I hope you do too when you pick up a book of Libertas.